Picture this. You're a captured soldier, thousands of miles from home, expecting the worst. Then your captors lead you into a room that changes everything you thought you knew about your enemy. What Lieutenant Marco Benedetti discovered in Camp Riverside would shatter every assumption he had about Americans, and it all started with something as simple as a book.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transport truck lurched to a final stop, its engine coughing into silence under the blazing Nevada sun. Lieutenant Marco Benedetti pressed his face against the canvas covering, catching his first glimpse of Camp Riverside through a gap in the fabric. Dust swirled across the compound like miniature tornadoes, and wooden barracks stretched in perfect rows toward the distant mountains. Marco's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his torn uniform jacket. 3 weeks ago, he'd been leading his reconnaissance unit through the hills outside Naples. Now, at 24, he was just another prisoner of war, one of 47 Italian soldiers crammed into the back of this American truck. "Welcome to your new home, gentlemen," called out Sergeant William Hayes from the driver's seat. His voice carried a surprising gentleness that Marco hadn't expected. During the long journey from the East Coast Processing Center, Hayes had shared his water rations and even offered cigarettes to the prisoners who spoke English. The canvas flaps flew open, revealing Hayes, a stocky man with graying temples and weathered hands that spoke of farm work before the war. Behind him stood Captain Robert Manning, the camp commander, whose reputation had preceded him. The Italian prisoners had heard whispers during processing. Manning ran a different kind of camp, one where strange things happened. "Single file, nice and easy," Hayes instructed in his broken Italian, gesturing toward a wooden platform. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Marco stepped down first, his legs unsteady after hours of confinement. The dry air hit his lungs like sandpaper, and he squinted against the harsh light reflecting off the camp's whitewashed buildings. Around him, his fellow prisoners emerged blinking and uncertain, their faces etched with the same mixture of fear and exhaustion that Marco felt in his bones. The camp was unlike anything Marco had imagined. Clean gravel pathways connected each building, and small gardens with actual flowers bloomed near the administrative offices. American soldiers walked their patrols with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, not pointed at the prisoners. One guard even nodded respectfully to Marco as he passed. "This way," Captain Manning said, his Italian surprisingly fluent. Marco studied the man's face, searching for signs of cruelty or deception, but found only tired professionalism. Manning was perhaps 45, with intelligent brown eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much war. They followed a pathway toward what appeared to be the main processing building. Along the way, Marco noticed other Italian prisoners working in various areas of the camp. Some tended vegetable gardens, others repaired equipment, and a few sat in the shade reading what looked like newspapers. None appeared malnourished or beaten. If anything, they seemed content. "You're probably wondering what kind of place this is," Manning said, falling into step beside Marco. "I imagine you've heard stories about American prisoner camps." Marco remained silent, though his mind raced. He'd indeed heard stories, tales of brutal interrogations, starvation rations, and prisoners forced to work until they collapsed. The reality before him challenged every assumption he'd carried since his capture. The processing building's interior was even more surprising. Clean wooden floors, proper lighting from electric bulbs, and walls painted a cheerful yellow. A large American flag hung beside a smaller Italian flag, a gesture that struck Marco as oddly respectful. Two Italian prisoners sat at desks, apparently helping with administrative work, while American clerks processed paperwork with methodical efficiency. "Giuseppe Torino," said one of the Italian prisoners, rising from his desk. He was older than Marco, perhaps 35, with the calloused hands of a craftsman. "I've been here 8 months. You'll find this place unusual." Manning gestured toward a row of chairs. "Please sit. We'll get through the paperwork quickly, then show you to your quarters. But first, there's something I'd like you to see." The captain disappeared through a side door, leaving the new arrivals with Hayes and the Italian assistants. Marco studied Torino's face, searching for signs of coercion or fear, but found only genuine warmth. The man's uniform was clean and well-maintained, and he wore shoes that appeared to be American-issued. Sturdy leather boots, not the cardboard substitutes Marco had grown accustomed to during the war. "How are you treated here?" Marco asked quietly in Italian. Torino's smile was genuine. "Better than I treated myself back home, if I'm honest. The Americans, they're not what we were told." Before Marco could respond, Manning returned carrying a thick leather-bound volume. He set it on the desk between them, and Marco read the gold lettering on the cover. "Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri." The book was in Italian, its pages worn smooth by countless hands. "This belongs to our library," Manning said. "One of 50,000 books we maintain for the prisoners' use. We have literature in 12 languages, including a complete collection of Italian classics. Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Manzoni, all available for anyone who wishes to read." Marco stared at the book, his mind struggling to process this information. 50,000 books? In a prisoner camp? He reached out tentatively and touched the leather cover, half expecting someone to slap his hand away. Instead, Manning pushed the volume toward him. "Please, take a look." Marco opened the book carefully, revealing pages of beautifully typeset Italian text. The familiar words of Dante's masterpiece seemed to glow on the page, each line a connection to home, to culture, to the life he'd left behind. His throat tightened unexpectedly. "We also have scientific texts, technical manuals, philosophy, poetry, and contemporary fiction," Manning continued. "The library operates on an honor system. Prisoners check out books themselves, return them when finished, and recommend titles to their fellow inmates." Hayes pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "We've found that men who keep their minds active adapt better to camp life. Reading reduces tension, prevents depression, and maintains the intellectual development that makes repatriation more successful." The concept was so foreign to Marco's expectations that he almost laughed. These Americans were concerned about their prisoners' intellectual development, about successful repatriation? In the Italian military, prisoners were considered lost causes at best, traitors at worst. "There's something else," Torino said, glancing at Manning for permission to continue. "We have educational programs, language classes, vocational training, even university-level courses taught by professors among the prisoners. I've learned to speak English better here than I ever did in school." Manning nodded toward another door. "Would you like to see the library before we complete your processing? I think it might help you understand what kind of place Camp Riverside really is." Marco looked around at his fellow prisoners, seeing the same stunned confusion on their faces that he felt. Everything they'd been taught about American brutality, about the necessity of resistance and the hopelessness of capture, was crumbling with each passing minute. "Yes," Marco said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I would very much like to see your library." As they walked toward the door, Marco caught sight of himself in a window. The frightened, defeated soldier who'd climbed down from the transport truck was already beginning to change. In his eyes, for the first time in months, was something that looked remarkably like hope. The wooden door opened onto a scene that defied everything Marco had believed about American prisoner camps. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows upon rows of bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling.
Paper and leather bindings, a smell that instantly transported Marco back to the university library in Bologna, where he'd spent countless hours before the war. "Mother of God!" whispered Corporal Antonio Ricci, one of the newer prisoners, as he stepped beside Marco. His voice carried the same awe that Marco felt building in his chest. The library occupied what had once been the camp's largest recreation hall. American carpenters had installed custom shelving along every available wall, creating narrow aisles that branched off from a central reading area. Comfortable wooden chairs surrounded heavy oak tables, each equipped with reading lamps that cast warm circles of light. Maps of Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific covered one entire wall, marked with colored pins that seemed to track the war's progress. "We converted this space 6 months ago," Manning explained, gesturing towards the reading tables where a dozen Italian prisoners sat absorbed in various books. "The men requested somewhere quiet to study and write letters home. What started as a small reading corner grew into this." Marco approached the nearest bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines. The Italian section alone contained hundreds of volumes, not just classics, but contemporary works, technical manuals, and even recent publications that had somehow made their way across the Atlantic during wartime. He pulled out a copy of The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, its pages crisp and unmarked. "How did you acquire all these books?" Marco asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sergeant Hayes emerged from behind a tall shelf, carrying a stack of newly catalogued volumes. "Donations, mostly. American families send books when they hear about our program. Some come from universities, others from public libraries that have excess copies. The Red Cross helped coordinate shipments from neutral countries for the foreign language sections." At one of the reading tables, a prisoner Marco recognized as Lieutenant Salvatore Moretti sat hunched over what appeared to be an engineering textbook, taking careful notes on a pad of paper. Moretti had been captured during the same North African campaign as Marco, but months earlier. The man looked healthier than Marco remembered. His cheeks had filled out, and his eyes held a clarity that spoke of mental engagement rather than the dull despair Marco had expected to find. "Moretti's working towards a correspondence degree in mechanical engineering," Torino explained quietly. "The Americans arranged for him to communicate with professors at the University of California. His exam papers get mailed back and forth through Swiss intermediaries." Marco stared at his former colleague, struggling to process this information. Not only were the Americans allowing prisoners to continue their education, they were actively facilitating it through neutral channels. The concept challenged every assumption he'd held about captivity and the nature of enemies.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We have 3 different English classes running each week," Manning continued, leading them deeper into the library. "Beginning, intermediate, and advanced. The advanced class focuses on American literature and history. Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Benjamin Franklin. We found that understanding American culture helps reduce tensions and improves cooperation." They passed a corner section devoted entirely to scientific journals and technical publications. A young Italian naval officer sat absorbed in what appeared to be an article on radar technology, while nearby an older prisoner studied agricultural techniques from an American farming magazine. The scene was surreal. Enemy soldiers voluntarily learning about American technology and methods while in captivity. "Do you worry about security?" Marco found himself asking. "Allowing prisoners access to technical information?" Manning smiled, the first genuine expression of humor Marco had seen from the man. "What you're seeing here isn't classified material. It's publicly available information that any civilian could access in an American library. Besides, we've found that treating prisoners with respect and intellectual honesty reduces escape attempts more effectively than armed guards and high fences." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything Marco had believed about military strategy and prisoner management. In the Italian army, prisoners were considered security threats first and human beings second. The idea that education and respect could be more effective than force seemed almost revolutionary. Hayes guided them towards a section labeled Italian Authors, Contemporary Works. The shelves contained books Marco had never heard of, recent publications that must have been printed after Italy entered the war. One title caught his eye: Letters from America, by an Italian journalist who had traveled across the United States in the late 1930s. "Many of your countrymen have written about America," Hayes observed, noticing Marco's interest. "Not all of it flattering, but we stock it anyway. We believe that understanding different perspectives makes everyone more thoughtful." Marco pulled the book from the shelf and flipped through its pages. The journalist's account described American cities, farms, and factories with the detailed eye of someone trying to understand a foreign culture. Some passages were critical, highlighting social problems and economic inequalities, while others expressed admiration for American innovation and democratic ideals. The fact that the Americans had deliberately chosen to include critical perspectives in their prisoner library spoke to a confidence that Marco found both impressive and unsettling. "There's a writing group that meets on Thursday evenings," Torino mentioned, pointing towards a table where several prisoners sat with notebooks and pencils. "They work on letters home, but also poetry, short stories, even a few memoirs. Some of the pieces have been quite extraordinary." One of the writers looked up from his work, a thin man with prematurely grey hair and intense dark eyes. Marco recognized him as Captain Francesco Romano, a veteran of the Ethiopian campaign who had been known for his fierce dedication to fascist ideology. Now Romano sat peacefully in an American prisoner library, crafting what appeared to be poetry with the focused attention of a professional writer. "Romano's been working on a series of sonnets about his hometown in Sicily," Torino explained quietly. "He says writing helps him process everything that's happened. Some of the verses are quite beautiful. They remind him that there's life beyond this war." The transformation evident in Romano struck Marco with particular force. This was a man who had once delivered passionate speeches about Italian superiority and the weakness of democratic societies. To see him calmly engaged in creative writing within the very heart of American democracy suggested changes that went far deeper than simple cooperation with captors. Manning gestured towards a bulletin board covered with handwritten notices in multiple languages. Prisoners post book recommendations, organize discussion groups, and share information about educational opportunities. We've had debates on philosophy, literature analysis sessions, and even technical workshops where prisoners with expertise teach others. Marco studied the notices, noting the mix of practical information and intellectual pursuits. Someone had posted a review of a recent novel, while another prisoner advertised a discussion group focused on Dante's political philosophy. A third notice invited participants for a weekly chess tournament with analysis of famous historical games. "The chess matches draw quite a crowd," Hayes observed. "We had to establish a rotation system so everyone gets a chance to participate. Competition can be fierce, but it's always friendly." At the far end of the library, Marco discovered something that stopped him in his tracks. An entire section was devoted to American newspapers and magazines. Current issues that couldn't be more than a few weeks old. The headlines spoke of Allied advances in Europe, political developments in Washington, and domestic news about American society during wartime. "You allow prisoners to read current news?" Marco asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Information isn't our enemy," Manning replied simply. "Men who understand what's happening in the world make better decisions about their own futures. We've found that prisoners who stay informed are more likely to cooperate and less likely to cling to false hopes about the war's outcome." Marco picked up a copy of Time magazine dated just 2 weeks earlier. The cover story dealt with Allied preparations for what appeared to be a major offensive in Europe. In any other prisoner camp, such current information would have been strictly forbidden. Yet here, it sat openly available for enemy soldiers to read and discuss. The implications were staggering. These Americans were so confident in their position, so secure in their ultimate victory, that they felt comfortable sharing strategic information with their captives. It spoke to a kind of psychological warfare that was far more sophisticated than anything Marco had encountered. The weaponization of truth itself. That evening, Marco lay on his assigned bunk staring at the ceiling of Barrack 7, his mind churning with everything he'd witnessed. Around him, his fellow prisoners whispered in the darkness, their conversations a mixture of disbelief and cautious excitement. The man in the bunk below him, Sergeant Paolo Conti, had spent the afternoon in the library's mathematics section, discovering calculus textbooks that surpassed anything he'd studied at the Technical Institute in Milan.
"They have books on airplane design," Conti murmured to the darkness. "Detailed engineering principles, aerodynamic theory, everything I dreamed of learning before this damned war started." Marco rolled onto his side, facing the window where Nevada moonlight filtered through simple cotton curtains. Even the window coverings spoke to the camp's unusual character. Fabric instead of bars, privacy instead of constant surveillance. Through the glass, he could see lights still burning in the library building, where prisoners were apparently free to study late into the night. The next morning brought new revelations. During the breakfast assembly, Marco noticed something remarkable about the camp's social dynamics. Italian prisoners moved freely between different areas, engaging in conversations with American guards that seemed more like discussions between colleagues than interactions between captors and captives. The guards carried weapons, but they were holstered or slung in relaxed positions that suggested mutual trust rather than constant threat. Corporal James Fletcher, a young guard from Ohio, approached Marco's table during the meal. "Lieutenant Benedetti, Captain Manning would like you to join the morning orientation group. There are some things about our educational programs that might interest someone with your background." Marco's military record had apparently preceded him. Before the war, he'd taught literature at a secondary school in Florence, a detail that American intelligence had somehow uncovered and filed away. The thoroughness of their prisoner documentation was both impressive and slightly unsettling. The orientation group met in a smaller building adjacent to the library. 7 Italian prisoners sat in a circle with Captain Manning and a civilian Marco hadn't encountered before, a thin, scholarly man with wire-rimmed glasses who introduced himself as Professor David Steinberg from the University of Nevada. "Professor Steinberg visits twice a week," Manning explained. "He coordinates our advanced education programs and maintains contact with universities across the country that have expressed interest in our prisoner students." Steinberg opened a thick folder filled with correspondence. "Currently, we have 12 prisoners enrolled in university courses through mail correspondence. 3 are pursuing engineering degrees, 4 are studying literature and languages, 2 are working on business administration, and 3 more are completing medical studies that were interrupted by the war." Marco studied the faces around the circle, recognizing several men from his transport. Their expressions mirrored his own amazement, but underneath the surprise, he detected something else. A hunger for the intellectual stimulation they'd been denied since capture. The Red Cross facilitates all academic correspondence, Steinberg continued. Exams are proctored here by camp personnel, then forwarded to universities for grading. Several prisoners have already completed full semesters of coursework. When the war ends, their credits will transfer to Italian universities or, if they choose to immigrate, to American institutions. The immigration comment hit Marco like a physical blow. These Americans weren't just educating their prisoners, they were preparing them for potential new lives in America itself. The long-term thinking involved in such a strategy suggested a confidence in victory that went far beyond military calculations. We've also established what we call the Cultural Exchange Initiative, Manning added. Italian prisoners with expertise in various fields teach courses to American personnel who are interested in learning. Last month, Lieutenant Romano conducted a seminar on Renaissance art history for our camp staff. Sergeant Torino has been teaching conversational Italian to guards who hope to serve in occupied Italy after the war. The concept of Italian prisoners teaching American soldiers about Italian culture created a cognitive dissonance that Marco struggled to process. His captors were not only allowing, but actively encouraging the preservation and sharing of Italian knowledge and traditions. It was a form of respect for enemy culture that contradicted every propaganda message he'd absorbed about American barbarism. Professor Steinberg pulled out a letter bearing Swiss postal markings. This arrived yesterday from the University of Florence. They've agreed to recognize coursework completed here by Italian prisoners, provided it meets their academic standards. We now have formal agreements with 7 Italian universities for post-war credit transfer. Marco's throat tightened as he recognized the letterhead. The University of Florence was where he'd planned to pursue his doctorate in literature before the war interrupted his academic career. The possibility that his captivity might actually advance rather than destroy his educational goals seemed almost too incredible to believe. "There's something else," Manning said, his tone becoming more serious. "We need prisoner volunteers for a special project. The War Department has requested assistance in developing more effective methods for psychological warfare in Europe. They want Italian prisoners to help create propaganda materials that will encourage surrender and reduce civilian resistance in occupied territories." The room fell silent. Here was the catch, the price for all this unprecedented generosity. The Americans wanted their prisoners to become active collaborators in the war effort. Marco felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Everything about Camp Riverside challenged his understanding of honor, loyalty, and duty. If he participated in American propaganda efforts, was he betraying Italy, or was he potentially saving Italian lives by encouraging faster surrender? The moral calculations involved were more complex than anything his military training had prepared him to handle. "Participation is entirely voluntary," Manning emphasized, apparently sensing the tension in the room. "No prisoner will face consequences for declining. However, those who do participate will receive additional educational opportunities and priority consideration for post-war immigration applications." Sergeant Conte leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of propaganda materials?" "Leaflets, primarily," Steinberg answered. "Radio broadcast scripts, materials that explain the reality of American prisoner treatment versus the horror stories circulated by German and Italian propaganda. The goal is to reduce unnecessary deaths by encouraging earlier surrender." The logic was compelling, but it required accepting that the war was already lost, a psychological leap that Marco wasn't certain he was ready to make.
Around the circle, I could see similar struggles playing out on the faces of his fellow prisoners. The Americans had created a situation where collaboration might actually represent the most humane choice. "You don't need to decide immediately," Manning said, rising from his chair. "Take time to think it over. Meanwhile, you're all welcome to continue with the regular educational programs regardless of your decision about the special project."
As the meeting dispersed, Marco found himself walking back toward the library with Lieutenant Romano, the former fascist officer who had undergone such a dramatic transformation. The two men moved in contemplative silence until Romano finally spoke. "I've been here 11 months, Romano said quietly. "In that time, I've learned more about America, about democracy, about human nature than I learned in 20 years of fascist education. These people aren't our enemies, Marco. They're our teachers." "But they're still the enemy," Marco replied, though his words lacked conviction. Romano stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Are they? Look around you. Look at what they've built here. They could have created a place of punishment and degradation. Instead, they've created a place of learning and growth. What does that tell you about their true nature?" Marco had no ready answer. Everything he'd been taught about American materialism and cultural inferiority crumbled when confronted with the evidence of Camp Riverside. These people had invested enormous resources in maintaining the intellectual and cultural development of their enemies, an act of faith in human dignity that transcended national boundaries. That afternoon, Marco returned to the library alone. He pulled down a volume of American poetry and settled into one of the comfortable reading chairs. The book opened to a Walt Whitman poem about the brotherhood of all humanity, written decades before the current war, but speaking directly to his present confusion about identity and loyalty. As he read, Marco began to understand that Camp Riverside represented more than just an unusual prisoner camp. It was a demonstration of American values in action, a living example of the democratic principles his captors claimed to be fighting for. The question that haunted him was whether those principles were strong enough to survive the hate and destruction of war itself. 3 weeks into his captivity, Marco discovered the camp's darkest secret hidden in plain sight. It came to light during what the Americans called Mail Day, a weekly event where prisoners received letters from home through Red Cross channels. Marco had been expecting nothing, having assumed that his family in Florence believed him dead, when Corporal Fletcher approached with a thin envelope bearing familiar handwriting. His sister Elena's letter was brief but devastating. Their father had died in an Allied bombing raid on Florence's railway yards. Their mother had suffered a breakdown and was living with relatives in the countryside. The Italy she described bore no resemblance to the proud nation Marco had left behind to fight for. "The most difficult part of being here," said a voice behind him. Marco turned to find Dr. Giuseppe Mariani, a captured army physician who had arrived at Camp Riverside 2 months earlier. "Learning that the world you thought you were defending no longer exists." Dr. Mariani had become something of an unofficial counselor to the newer prisoners, helping them process the psychological trauma of capture and separation. His own story was particularly tragic. His entire medical unit had been wiped out during the retreat from Tunisia, leaving him as the sole survivor. "I've been reading about something called survivor's guilt in the camp's psychology texts," Mariani continued, settling into a chair beside Marco. "American researchers have identified it as a specific condition affecting prisoners of war. The knowledge that others suffered while we found safety creates its own form of torture." Marco folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking slightly. Around the mailroom, similar scenes played out as prisoners absorbed news from home.
Some men wept openly, others stared into space with hollow expressions, and a few crushed their letters into balls and threw them away unfinished. "The Americans document everything," Mariani observed quietly. "They study our reactions, our adaptation patterns, our psychological responses to different stimuli. We're not just prisoners here, we're subjects in a vast experiment in human behavior modification." The revelation hit Marco like a cold wave. All the kindness, the educational opportunities, the respect for prisoner dignity, it was part of a carefully designed program to reshape their fundamental beliefs and loyalties. The library wasn't just a gesture of goodwill. It was a weapon more sophisticated than any rifle or artillery piece. "Does that make it less real?" Marco asked, surprising himself with the question. Mariani considered this carefully. "I don't think so. The food still nourishes us, the books still educate us, the medical care still heals us. The fact that it serves American strategic purposes doesn't diminish its human value. Perhaps that's the most disturbing thing of all. They found a way to make psychological warfare indistinguishable from genuine compassion." That evening, Marco attended his first session of the weekly discussion group that met in the library's philosophy section. The topic was Machiavelli's The Prince, chosen with what Marco now recognized as deliberate irony. 8 Italian prisoners sat in a circle, while American observers took notes from a discreet distance. The discussion leader was Professor Antonio Valdez, a captured military historian who had taught at the University of Bologna before the war. Valdez had adapted to captivity by transforming himself into an academic bridge between Italian and American intellectual traditions. Machiavelli argued that effective leadership requires the ability to adapt one's methods to changing circumstances. But what happens when the circumstances change so fundamentally that traditional concepts of leadership become obsolete? The question sparked immediate debate among the prisoners. Some argued that core principles must remain constant regardless of circumstances, while others suggested that survival itself required flexibility in moral calculations. Marco found himself drawn into the discussion despite his initial reluctance. "Consider our current situation," Marco said slowly. "We were trained to see Americans as cultural and moral inferiors. Yet we find ourselves in a camp that operates according to principles more humane than our own military's treatment of prisoners. How do we reconcile this contradiction?" Lieutenant Enzo Calabria, a fierce nationalist who had resisted every aspect of camp life, leaned forward aggressively. "We can't reconcile it. We recognize it as sophisticated manipulation designed to break our resistance. Everything here, the books, the education, the comfortable conditions, it's all intended to make us forget our duty to Italy. But what if our duty to Italy is better served by learning from this experience?" countered Sergeant Roberto Neri, who had been quietly studying American agricultural techniques. The debate continued for nearly 2 hours, touching on questions of loyalty, adaptation, and the nature of patriotism itself. Marco realized that the Americans had created a situation where even resistance took the form of intellectual engagement, a trap so subtle that fighting it only deepened its effectiveness.
After the discussion ended, Marco remained in the library, drawn to a section he had previously avoided, books about American history and political philosophy. He selected a volume on the American Civil War, curious about how a democratic society had handled the challenge of internal division and reconstruction. What he discovered was deeply unsettling. The United States had fought its most devastating war against itself, yet had emerged stronger and more unified. The same principles now being applied to Camp Riverside, education, economic opportunity, political inclusion, had been used to reintegrate Confederate prisoners and civilians after their defeat. What he discovered was deeply unsettling. The United States had fought its most devastating war against itself, yet had emerged stronger and more unified. The same principles now being applied to Camp Riverside, education, economic opportunity, political inclusion, had been used to reintegrate Confederate prisoners and civilians after their defeat. Marco was reading about Reconstruction policies when he noticed Dr. Mariani approaching with a thick folder under his arm. The physician looked troubled, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "I need to show you something," Mariani said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I've been working with the camp medical staff on a study of prisoner health and adaptation. What I've discovered, it changes everything." He opened the folder to reveal detailed charts and statistical analyses. "The Americans have been tracking every aspect of our physical and mental health since arrival. Recovery rates, weight gain, psychological stability markers, educational engagement levels. They have complete data on every prisoner who's ever been held here." Marco studied the charts, noting the dramatic improvements in prisoner health across all categories. Men who had arrived malnourished and traumatized showed rapid recovery once exposed to the camp's regime of proper nutrition, medical care, and intellectual stimulation. "Look at the correlation patterns," Mariani continued, pointing to a specific chart. "Prisoners who engage most actively with the educational programs show the fastest psychological recovery, but also the most complete shift in political attitudes. The Americans have essentially weaponized human dignity." The implications were staggering. Camp Riverside wasn't just maintaining prisoners, it was systematically converting them into advocates for American values and post-war cooperation. The process was so gradual and seemingly voluntary that most prisoners, like Marco himself, participated willingly without recognizing the transformation occurring within them. "There's more," Mariani said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been corresponding with medical colleagues in other camps through official channels. This model is being replicated across dozens of facilities. The Americans are preparing an entire generation of European prisoners to serve as post-war ambassadors for American influence." Marco closed the book he had been reading, his mind reeling with the strategic brilliance of what the Americans had accomplished. They had found a way to turn military defeat into ideological victory, transforming their enemies into allies through the simple expedient of treating them as human beings worthy of respect and education. "The question," Mariani concluded, "is whether it matters that we understand the mechanism or whether the transformation is now irreversible." Looking around the library at his fellow prisoners absorbed in their studies, Marco realized that the answer might not matter. Whether conscious or unconscious, the change was already complete. They were no longer the same men who had been captured months ago, and there was no path back to their former selves. The Americans had won a victory more complete than any military conquest. They had captured not just bodies, but minds and hearts. And the most disturbing aspect of all was that Marco wasn't entirely certain he wanted to resist. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when news arrived that would force Marco to make the most difficult decision of his life. Captain Manning called an emergency assembly in the main hall, his face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction that immediately put the prisoners on edge. "Gentlemen," Manning announced, his voice carrying across the packed room, "I've received official confirmation that the Italian government has signed an armistice with the Allied forces. As of yesterday, Italy is no longer at war with the United States." The hall erupted in chaos. Some cheered, others sat in stunned silence, and a few began arguing loudly about the implications. Marco felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the fundamental reality of his situation transformed in an instant.
He was no longer a prisoner of war, but he wasn't exactly free either. Manning raised his hand for silence. This changes your legal status significantly. You are now considered co-belligerents rather than enemy prisoners. However, given the ongoing conflict in northern Italy and the uncertain political situation, immediate repatriation is not possible. The camp will continue operating under modified protocols. Lieutenant Calabria, the fierce nationalist who had resisted every aspect of camp life, stood up abruptly. What about those of us who refused to recognize this surrender? What about those who remained loyal to the legitimate government in the north? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Northern Italy remains under German occupation and Mussolini's puppet regime. The armistice had effectively split Italy into two warring factions, and the prisoners now faced a choice between competing definitions of patriotism. "That decision is yours to make," Manning replied carefully. "However, I should inform you that we've received authorization to begin voluntary recruitment for a special unit of Italian soldiers who wish to assist in the liberation of their homeland. Those who volunteer will receive advanced military training and eventual deployment to the Italian theater." Marco's mind raced as he processed this information. The Americans were offering them a chance to actively participate in the invasion of their own country, an opportunity to help drive out the Germans and restore democratic government to Italy. It was the logical culmination of everything that had happened at Camp Riverside, the final test of how completely their loyalties had been transformed. That evening, the library became the center of intense debate as prisoners grappled with their new reality. The comfortable reading chairs had been rearranged into discussion circles, and passionate arguments echoed through the normally quiet space. Books lay forgotten on tables as men wrestled with questions that would define the rest of their lives. Marco found himself in the philosophy section with Dr. Mariani, Professor Valdez, and a handful of other prisoners who had become the camp's informal intellectual leadership. The weight of decision pressed down on all of them, but Marco felt it most acutely as someone who had initially resisted the camp's influence. "The Americans have played this perfectly," Dr. Mariani observed, his voice heavy with admiration and resentment. "They've created a situation where collaboration has become indistinguishable from patriotism. How do you resist an enemy who offers you the chance to liberate your own homeland?" Professor Valdez pulled down a volume of political philosophy, his hands shaking slightly. "Perhaps the question isn't whether to resist, but whether resistance has any meaning when the circumstances have changed so fundamentally. Italy as we knew it no longer exists. The question is what we want to help create in its place."
Through the library windows, Marco could see groups of prisoners gathered in the courtyard, their animated discussions visible even at a distance. Some men had already made their decisions. Sergeant Torino had volunteered for the special unit within hours of the announcement, while Lieutenant Calabria had formally requested transfer to a camp for non-cooperative prisoners. "I keep thinking about something I read here," Marco said slowly. "An American philosopher named William James wrote about the moral equivalent of war, the idea that societies need shared challenges that bring out their highest virtues without requiring actual violence. What if that's what the Americans have created here?" The others looked at him with surprise. Marco had been known for his skepticism about American motives, his resistance to the camp's more obvious attempts at influence. To hear him quoting American philosophy represented a transformation none of them had expected. "You think this has all been a test?" Dr. Mariani asked. "Not a test," Marco replied, choosing his words carefully. "An education. They've shown us that it's possible to treat enemies with dignity, to maintain principles even during wartime, to see beyond immediate conflicts toward long-term reconciliation. Whether we learned those lessons or not was up to us. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Romano, the former fascist officer whose transformation had been so dramatic. He carried a letter bearing official American military letterhead and looked as though he'd seen a ghost. "I've been accepted," Romano announced quietly. "The special unit. But that's not the important part." He held up the letter with trembling hands. "They're offering me a commission in the new Italian army that will be formed after the war. Not just as a soldier, but as an officer responsible for democratic education and reconstruction." The implications hit Marco like a physical blow. The Americans weren't just recruiting soldiers, they were selecting future leaders for post-war Italy. Every prisoner who had engaged seriously with the camp's educational programs, who had demonstrated genuine transformation of values, was being offered a role in shaping their homeland's future. "There's something else," Romano continued. "Captain Manning wants to see you, Marco. Privately." 20 minutes later, Marco sat across from Manning in the captain's private office, a room he had never entered before. The space was surprisingly modest: functional furniture, military maps on the walls, and a small bookshelf containing volumes on psychology, political science, and military history. "Lieutenant Benedetti," Manning began, "your file makes for interesting reading. Former literature teacher, reserved but intelligent. Initial resistance to camp programs followed by gradual engagement. Dr. Mariani's psychological evaluations describe you as someone who thinks deeply before making decisions." Marco waited, sensing that Manning was building towards something. "We have a special position available," Manning continued. "The War Department is establishing education centers in newly liberated territories. They need officers who understand both Italian and American educational systems, who can help rebuild schools and universities according to democratic principles. The position would involve extensive training in the United States, followed by deployment to Italy as an education advisor." The offer was staggering in its implications. Marco would not only be helping to liberate Italy, he would be helping to reshape its entire educational system according to principles he had learned as a prisoner of war. It was the ultimate irony, using knowledge gained in captivity to free his own countrymen from ignorance and authoritarianism. "There's something else," Romano continued. "Captain Manning wants to see you, Marco. Privately." 20 minutes later, Marco sat across from Manning in the captain's private office, a room he had never entered before. The space was surprisingly modest: functional furniture, military maps on the walls, and a small bookshelf containing volumes on psychology, political science, and military history. "Lieutenant Benedetti," Manning began, "your file makes for interesting reading. Former literature teacher, reserved but intelligent. Initial resistance to camp programs, followed by gradual engagement. Dr. Mariani's psychological evaluations describe you as someone who thinks deeply before making decisions." Marco waited, sensing that Manning was building towards something. "We have a special position available," Manning continued. "The War Department is establishing education centers in newly liberated territories. They need officers who understand both Italian and American educational systems, who can help rebuild schools and universities according to democratic principles. The position would involve extensive training in the United States, followed by deployment to Italy as an education advisor." The offer was staggering in its implications. Marco would not only be helping to liberate Italy, he would be helping to reshape its entire educational system according to principles he had learned as a prisoner of war. It was the ultimate irony, using knowledge gained in captivity to free his own countrymen from ignorance and authoritarianism. "Why me?" Marco asked. Manning smiled, the first completely genuine expression Marco had seen from the man. "Because you understand what we've accomplished here. You've experienced firsthand how education and respect can transform even enemies into allies. That understanding will be crucial in post-war reconstruction." Marco looked through the office window toward the library, where prisoners continued their evening discussions under warm electric lights. In that building, surrounded by 50,000 books, he had discovered truths about human nature that no amount of propaganda could have taught him. The Americans had given him something far more than freedom. They had given him perspective. "I accept," Marco said quietly. 2 months later, as Marco prepared to leave Camp Riverside for officer training in Virginia, he made one final visit to the library. The space looked exactly the same comfortable chairs, the same walls lined with books in a dozen languages, the same atmosphere of quiet intellectual engagement. But Marco himself had been transformed beyond recognition. He pulled down the same copy of Dante's Divine Comedy that Captain Manning had shown him on his first day. The familiar words seemed to glow on the page, but now they carried new meaning. Dante's journey from darkness to light paralleled his own passage from hatred to understanding, from ignorance to wisdom. As Marco prepared to leave the library for the last time, he noticed a new addition to the bulletin board. A handwritten note from a recently arrived German prisoner expressing amazement at the camp's educational opportunities. The cycle was beginning again. Another enemy soldier discovering that his captor's greatest weapon was their willingness to treat him as a human being, capable of growth and change. Marco smiled as he walked toward the exit, carrying with him not just the memory of 50,000 books, but the knowledge that ideas, properly shared, possessed the power to transform the world itself. The Americans won their war not through superior firepower, but through superior faith in human nature. In the end, that faith had proven to be their most devastating weapon of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.